Well, first of all, let me say a million thanks to CAMLA and to the CCGI board for setting this whole thing up. I'm not sure how CAMLA actually sleeps or whether she ever sleeps, but her ability to span 6 continents and to talk us in the most charming way into doing all sorts of things we didn't really want to do in the first place is wonderful. So an absolute treasure. And I really appreciate the amount of work and the quality of the work that you've put into this session. Today, because Ronaele Daythorne Bayrd is currently in a force 1 hurricane and without electricity and now flooded, she obviously cannot be on air. So I said I would take over part of her session as well. So what I intend to do is to talk about 3 separate aspects this morning. One is the mindset change that is going on in my head as I've listened in as and when I can during the week. 2 is to talk a bit about the topic for this morning, which is on groups and the conglomerates and the governance thereof. And then finally, to pick up something that Ronaele and I were going to do together, which was talk about the board review, particularly when associated with conglomerates and subsidiaries and all those types of organization. After which I will pass over to Alison to respond in whichever way she wishes. And then after that, I hope we will have plenty of time to open up to the membership of this session to discuss the issues. So that's my little framework. So the first part is the mindset change, which is not so much a change, but a reinforcement of work I've been doing for a long time. But I think it came together very nicely with Mervyn King's presentation on Sunday evening, because the responses that came back from that were so strong that I, as I meant to be finishing a book by Sunday, I decided I would just go back to the opening of the book and reinforce the points that he was making, that essentially corporations are impersonal. They're set up as legal entities. They have no personality really other than that legal one. And therefore they have no mind, no heart, and certainly no conscience. Now, we've known that for a long time, but the public doesn't know that. And the public get very angry with many boards because they don't seem to show any conscience. And I was just reminded that the big change I see going on in many, many countries around the world, and luckily I span 5 of the 6 continents, is the awareness that the previous focus on shareholder value, particularly underpinned by finance and reporting and codes and such like, is beginning to fracture. I've been very rude in my previous books and talked about the stranglehold of accountants and auditors on corporate governance. And I'm saying it's none of their business. That is not corporate governance. It's an output from corporate governance, but it's not the input side. And I was just reinforced in that thinking that we really do need as boards to accept that we pay executives well to run the operations of the business. And we expect them to have control systems that allow us to handle that prudent control side of the role of the board. But what we tend to do is stick with them and try and manage them from the boardroom table. What I'm trying to do is say, no, boards have a much more important role, which is to look into the future and try and ensure a healthy future for their company or their organization if it's a not-for-profit. And I would say that that certainly came across very strongly following the responses to Professor King's talk. So this notion of that I've had for many, many years of the business brain being central to the learning board has been reinforced with the idea that the board is both the brain and the conscience of a learning board. and I'm working on that right now. And I think that can be argued throughout history, at least since 1776 and Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, because he did point out at the very beginning that there are four things that seem to be unlimited in this wonderful concept of creating joint stock companies, for which he was very, very pro. But he did remind us that we also have to balance that with moral sentiment. And he's very strong. In fact, the previous book he had written was on moral sentiment. And he said that we have to be careful. It's a wonderful human invention, the joint stock company, but we don't put any limits on it. So it has unlimited size, unlimited life, unlimited license to do what it wants, really, and therefore unlimited power. And I think bring together what Professor King said and what I'm trying to do there focuses on the output of the book I'm writing, which is say, yes, we're moving in the direction of ESG as being more important than shareholder value creation. They're both important, but ESG is becoming more important. But I'm arguing that we have to be very careful, because without entrepreneurship, the E and the S and even the G don't actually have much meaning. So I'm arguing for EES plus G. Proper entrepreneurship, our real job, creating the future for the company, followed by our impact on the physical environment and our impact on the social environment, and then ensuring that we add to that good governance. And that's what I've really taken out of this week. Okay, so I'll pause there just for a second whilst I cough, have a drink, and then talk a little bit about groups and conglomerates. I'm fascinated by this because it's all about power. The only time I have been physically assaulted and knocked out in a corporate governance session was about the relationship between headquarters and subsidiaries. And it was in South Africa with a very large multinational company. And I was working with their chairman for Africa, and it was all going very well. And we were actually training, there are 120 companies, subsidiaries, all of them registered companies in their various countries across Africa. So 120 of those. And instead of going head first into this area, the chairman and I decided that the best way of handling it was to bring all 120 company secretaries together and spend a good few days with them going through the future role of a professional company secretary as needed for the way the company was going to develop. And that went down extremely well. Unfortunately, in the room also were a couple of other very senior people from headquarters in London. And as I left the room, one of them came up and frankly threw a punch at me. This was a bit of a shock. And he was so angry, he was incandescent with rage. And he said, for 20 years, I have been trying to ensure that all the African companies pay obeisance to headquarters in London without question. What you have just done has wrecked 20 years of my professional life. And he was pretty bloody angry, to say the least. But some of the company secretaries rescued me. And then we had a roaring argument in the corridor, at the end of which he apologized profusely and just said, I'm sorry. It just blew up. But it showed to me the power, the tension that there is if we're talking about large groups and subsidiaries that can exist between a headquarters function and the other functions. So that is something that literally has stayed with me I shan't forget that. But on the other hand, it illustrated to me the shift in powers, because when we sat down later with the same guy and we were talking it through, we said, well, hang on a second. You may want to consolidate all power in London, but there's no way you can do it. And the reason for that is increasingly in these countries across Africa, and it's the same in other parts of the world, their governments are insisting that they have oversight of their companies, the companies operating in their nation. And behind that is the notion of the license to operate. And they increasingly are saying, only we as the national government can give you a license to operate in this country. Now, there's people who debate that, but that was what was being accepted by the headquarters in London in the end. They didn't like it, and they had to rethink everything, and they had to rethink their corporate structure, but more importantly, they had to rethink their power structures. And what we were trying to do was to say to them, look, this license to operate, yes, you cannot give in to such things like corruption and so on, but the license to operate is quite reasonable in terms of the way you use and sometimes abuse their physical environment, their social structures, and their financial structures. So how is it we can have separate and great clarification of the role of the board in your country and the relationship of that to the international headquarters? And that, I won't go into the detail of that at the moment, but that was a key question, which they were actually very good, international headquarters, in accepting and saying, we don't particularly like it, but in future, we know that that's how it's going to be. So we must structure to do that. Which then set off a whole series of other debates. Part of it was structural. Do we try and devolve sufficient powers to those national subsidiaries, and they were all subsidiaries in this case, but allow the growth of a much more federated structure? So they have some powers which are agreed with us. Yes, that was the road in which they eventually decided to go down, but it still left all sorts of tensions. And the biggest one of all is, and it's still around everywhere that I see in large groups or in conglomerates, is does the subsidiary or local board have the power to say no to the international board? Under what circumstances can they say no? And that still is unresolved in most countries. However, there's a grudging acceptance by the international headquarters, I know, that there are going to be increasing numbers of cases where a local board saying, no, we cannot do that, or no, we choose not to do that because of the following reasons, are being raised. And that is a massive issue at the moment. Now, against that particularly, we have the Americans. And they have a particular worldview, I would say a very imperialistic worldview, and it certainly comes out in trade negotiations, of what they call extraterritoriality. Absolutely ghastly word, but that's where they are. And that basically says that if, particularly in financial, economic areas, trade areas, there is any possible connection to the US, then you must use US law and US reporting structures and audit structures if you're going to do business with us. And that is still very much around and still very strong in a lot of US minds, that really they determine the rules of international trade. And you must, as we say nowadays, pay obeisance to that. And that's tricky. It's becoming increasingly tricky, especially as China begins to make similar notions, although luckily the Chinese legal system is not so strongly developed. It can be very binary, but I'm happy to say that underpinning most of it in trade terms at the moment is the Hong Kong legal system. And so I'm even happier to say that's based on common law for the most part. So we have some flexibility and experience of dealing with that type of system rather than the draconian extraterritoriality, can't even say it, of the US system. That is up in the air for us to try and work out how we're going to handle this as world trade and world politics develops. I think that's most probably all I'm going to say on the conglomerates bit at the moment, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions to come back, a lot of people in the audience who want to respond to that. So I've tried to keep it as simple and as clear as possible from my side to open up the argument. The third part then is to do with board review. And I'm deliberately not saying board evaluation or board assessment, because those are judgmental terms. And the way I approach this, and have done over 20 years working with my wife Sally on finding schemes by which we can actually have really powerful and fact-based debates around the boardroom table on how we develop the company and therefore how we develop ourselves. And that is in our lives still very much a continuing activity. But what I've done in consultation with Ronaele is just put up 4 simple slides. Can we have the slides on, please, on air? Just to show you the sort of process we go through. And I did go through this working with Ronaele in one of the biggest financial companies in the Caribbean 2 years ago now. And that meant, and it was the biggest simultaneous board review I've ever seen anywhere. It was the main board, and then in parallel, the holding company board, and then in parallel to that, the 8 subsidiary boards, one of which was in West Africa. And when I originally spoke with the chairman, I was slightly nervous because I'd never handled such a big piece of work, because the processing of that amount of data is quite large. But he was very, very determined that he wanted to hand on to his successor, who was coming in about 18 months' time, a really detailed analysis of both the strengths and particularly the weaknesses to be found not just in the main board and the holding company board, but in all the other boards. So the incoming chairman, who they were pretty sure was not going to be from the industry, would have the best possible developmental map available for them. So that person could look at where they wish to deploy their scarce resources to take the company forward. So the first thing I'll say with this little list here is that Sally and I would refuse point blank to do a board review unless the company is already fully compliant. What we don't use board reviews for is to test out how they can become compliant, which means that we don't do a lot of work in some ways. You know, a lot of companies say, oh, we wanted you to do that as well. We won't. That's up to them. We're happy to work with the company secretary, to work with the chairman on identifying areas where they must become compliant, but we won't do that work. And so we only start when they can come to us to say, we think we are now fully compliant. Where do we go from here? And then we talk quite a bit with the chairman and the company secretary, who becomes the logistics officer for this type of board review to say what we're going to do is actually get the board to self-evaluate, self-review. We as external consultants will make a few comments at the end, but it's important to get their view of themselves very, very clearly identified and measured from the start. And in addition to that, we'll ask the chairman, are there any particular prompt questions you want us to ask to our questionnaire? If there are any very special issues you want tested. So it is the board's unique view of itself. And then we say, look, we've got typically 100 questions to 120 questions. And I'll come into the framework later. But the key thing we want to do is not just tick a box and say, yes, we do that, or no, we don't do that, or give a single figure. Yes, we're 8 out of 10 or whatever for that. What interests us is where each member of the board, or in this case, the many boards, think they are, their actual position. And then we want a separate mark as to where they ideally would like the board to be. So we get a gap analysis, therefore we get differences for each individual, and then we get ranges across the whole board. And that is, I won't say it's a unique approach, but it's a very different approach to many people who do board reviews or evaluations. And the important thing for us in that is that we can then set benchmarks for the future development of the board. So this is an investment, not just in ticking the box that we've done the assessment, but actually having done such an assessment that we can debate it in great detail using numbers as well as qualitative statements and develop from there. So we have a questionnaire, and the questionnaire will go out usually about 1 week ahead, at least 1 week ahead of the agreed dates we have for each person to be interviewed. And I stress interviewed anonymously. We have a questionnaire, and on that they will put their marks where they actually think the board is on that issue, and ideally where they would like it to be. They can scribble notes on the side of the questionnaire. They're encouraged to do so as to what they think the issues are. That review, their personal review, is then brought to their personal interview, which is where Sally, I, Ronaele will go through them question by question, looking at why they answered in that way and allowing them to change or develop issues there. We take notes of the whole thing. We found, certainly at this level of an organization, it's best to be seen to be writing by hand rather than physically recording, electronically recording. And we offer our handwritten notes and later our typed up notes to every single participant anonymously. So if they're uncomfortable with anything they think they may have said, they can see what was said. We will not redact it, but they have the basis of what was said. And then we just go through, particularly with the company secretary, booking an interview, which is normally 2 hours, and making sure very, very much so with the chairman and the whole board that a review session is arranged normally 2 months into the future, where they're effectively going to spend a whole day looking at their figures. We make their verbatims, the word they speak, available, but anonymously, and they're usually online. They can be up to 200 pages. Most people think that's ridiculous, but you'll be surprised how many members of, say, a 12-person board really are very, very keen to actually have a look at both what they said and think about that, but also to try and second guess who said what else. But they're even more keen to look at the figures, the statistics, the trend lines coming out to have a look at what might be the benchmark for the future. May I have the second slide, please? This is the learning board model. So what we're doing, the first part of the review takes each of those 4 quarters, the policy formulation one, the strategic thinking one, the supervising management one, and the accountability one. And then we tease out the questions that you can see down here. And I won't go into those in any detail now. They're written up in the book, the fish rots and the head. But what we're looking for is the words they use and the mindsets they're using to make sure that they're mainly congruent, they're mainly in line. And we sometimes find that different people are using very different words that mean very different things around the same boardroom table. So that's something that's rather we're keen to pull out. But the other thing we're trying to do is look here, how do they monitor the external environment, but then how do they take it into strategy? We have a series of questions around that, the way in which they position in the changing markets, set their corporate direction, and review and decide then their key resources. And also look at whether they have the implementation processes by which such strategic thinking, working with the executives, can actually be taken into delivery. So that arrowhead here is absolutely crucial for the development of the board, as is this one here, which is the handover point really between the board and the executive, even though they've both been working together in the latter parts of this thing. And then this is where really trusting and developing the management, which is a separate activity, is so important. And that arrowhead leads into your proper accountability, which comes back to ensuring proper compliance, which I mentioned at the beginning. So we've got a cycle, and sometimes there are sub-cycles within that occurs during the questionnaire, the review that we're doing. And people remember filling in on every single question, where do we think we actually are and where ideally would we like to be, and where they wish, making comments on that. Can we go to the next slide, please? So that's the learning board framework I've just said, and then we add to that questions around the actual effectiveness of the board processes, the committee processes, the board and executive interface, how that works, relationships with stakeholders in detail. And then we ask the question, whereas it's all been anonymous up until this point, we ask the question, but on the chairman's role, rather than trying to do a detailed analysis of the chairman's personality, and on the company secretary's role in holding the board together and ensuring that there is some sort of conscience of the board. And then we have one final question, which is what can be learned from other boards? And it's remarkable what flows out of that. So can we have the final slide, please? So the output then is a range of statistics which shows trends and ranges and priorities for the whole board. So we've agglomerated those. Availability online to the personal verbatims of the words everybody said throughout, which we have done a factor analysis on, looking at the words, looking at the mindsets, and those form then part of the consultant's report, which is very short. It's often between 12 and no more ever than 20 pages that says, this is what you've said about yourselves. And from our experience outside, this is what we think about what you're saying. Here are some areas where we think you are actually underestimating how good you are. And here are areas where we think you are really desperately overestimating how good you are. And we try and give examples and contacts for them to be able to test this themselves. So looking at emergent patterns and priorities from there. And then from that, working with the board, particularly with the chairman at this stage, beginning to draft an outline for a board development plan. That's the point at which we would physically leave the board review. If the chairman and the directors want to go further, that's fine. There is a development plan outlined for them. It's up to them whether they come back to us. I say, but I mean this in the nicest possible way. They often don't come back to us. Or at least they don't come back to us normally for at least over a year, sometimes 2 years, where they work out their own way forward and then come back to us to test it. By chance, yesterday, I got an email in from the chairman of this particular company saying, we haven't talked for ages, but now we're getting to a point where we've used what you were suggesting. We've developed our own version of that. We tested it out already over the last year, and now we want to talk to you again. And then quite separately, we've always left in an option for personal development plans, because as we go through this, many directors are saying, this has highlighted areas I just either don't know anything about or I do too much of, but that means I don't do enough of other things. That is entirely up to them personally if they want to proceed on that. And as I say, we 2 years ago, working with Ronaele, went through this at the level of the main board, the holding company board, and then the 8 subsidiary boards. As I said, the amount of processing was extraordinary, even by our standards, but it has proved extremely rich data, so much so that when the incoming chairman saw it, one of the few times in my life when a male chairman has given me a huge hug and said, this is absolute gold dust. I've never known such rich data for an incoming chairman who can see every major debate, all the priorities of each of the boards, their ideas of how to move forward. It's given me such a great start that what I have to do is thank the outgoing chairman, because without his particular wisdom and foresight, we would never have such data. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Garratt. That was a fascinating contribution, that began with the very provocative notion that what we focus on is board review and not necessarily a board evaluation as such. So it takes away that whole judgmental point of view, and I really enjoyed listening to the process in which, that whole board evaluation or board review process, let me correct myself, it can take place when you are dealing with parent and subsidiary boards. But I want to engage the questions first of all, but I would remind persons, you are free to either raise your hands virtually to let us know that you have a question or a comment, or of course you may type your question or comment in the chat. But the whole issue of the point of view between the parent board and the subsidiary board, and the one for which you were physically assaulted, Professor Garratt.
Yes.
And to be quite honest, that continues to be a very challenging issue, because for many of us, you basically become, first of all, indoctrinated in that concept that it is parent board philosophy. It is parent board which has the power to be able to send directives and make decisions, and subsidiaries are meant to simply carry it out. And I'm pretty sure that there are many organizations which continue to hold that point of view. So being able to address that particular question, first of all, that separates the responsibility, it can be a very difficult challenge moving forward. So can you share with us, from that experience, whether in other areas you are finding the similar fight having to take place, or is the message now something that is more common from your point of view?
No, it still needs a lot of work. I think better, shall we ask Alison to come in at that point to respond, and then we can both pick it up together there, because she has other experiences.
Sure.
Yes, and I have a funny story to tell that actually involved Trinidad. It must now have been probably about 17 or 18 years ago. I was given the job of, there was a change to UK law, which meant for the first time for the executive share option plan, we had to write to every subsidiary, and we sent them a set of minutes and said, could you please just get your board to fill in these minutes and send them back to us when they've been signed to approve the senior executive in your organisation's share option award from the global scheme. Well, I think we wrote to about 150 different countries, and 2 countries wrote back and said no. One of them was Trinidad, the other was Nigeria. And they both kind of said, you know, our boards have looked at this and we don't think that our CEO has actually performed as well as he should have done. And therefore, we don't think he should get this award. Now, my first reaction, to be absolutely honest, was, hang on a minute, who do they think they are? Because, you know, we own them, more or less. I mean, I think in both cases, it wasn't 100%, but it was certainly the majority. And we'd never had anybody come back to us and say no before. So after I'd got over the initial shock, and I thought, well, actually, they have a right to do this. And I had to kind of go and explain to HR what had happened and say, well, you know, this is actually governance working as it should. So we need to take deep breaths, and we need to then go and engage with them to try and work out how we can resolve this in a way that, you know, the CEO, who was an expat, was happy, the board of the subsidiary was happy, and in a way HR were happy, because this was messing up all their statistics. And we did kind of come to an agreement, which kind of then led to both the CEOs then requesting for transfers, because obviously I think they felt if they were anywhere else in the world, they would have got better share awards than they actually did. So I think, you know, it does happen from time to time, but I mean, I agree with Bob, it's not the norm. I mean, normally if instructions come from head office, they tend to be followed. And I think, you know, from a governance perspective, and I spend a lot of time talking to subsidiary boards and certainly management of subsidiaries about the fact that, you know, if the CEO does get an instruction from their boss, who might be the CEO of the parent, or you know, of maybe a middle between them and the parent, that they need to consider, does this need to go to the board? And what happens if it does go to the board? I can't just implement it. And I don't know, Bob, if you were aware of what happened in Malawi. Do you know about in Malawi with the tobacco?
Oh.
A few years ago, there was a joint venture between Press Corp, which is the major conglomerate in Malawi, and one of the tobacco companies in the US. And the CEO of the joint venture was one of the American executives. And he received an instruction from the US to change the way that tobacco was bought. And he just implemented that decision. And it basically almost brought the country of Malawi to an absolute bankruptcy. because there was just no way that way of buying would work in that environment. And the board, which obviously had half press corps people on it from Malawi, basically said if it had come to us, we would have been able to explain why this would not have worked in our country. And, you know, there were political implications. All the visas were withdrawn from a lot of expats overnight. It was a really big kind of both political as well as business impact of a parent, and in this case, half a parent, giving an instruction directly in through the management line and missing the board. So, you know, it does happen, and it's something that you need to be watching out for.
I understand that, Alison, and you know what it raised in my mind is another very fundamental question. So the world now is looking at the way in which organizations even get their raw materials and their supplies, right? So from what you were saying, now it reminds me that in managing the supply chain, the parent company still needs to be extremely careful of how their subsidiaries would even interact with suppliers and gain their raw materials or resources or so. And so, for instance, we have in the UK, the 2010 Modern Slavery Act, which requires that the company ensure that it does not engage in the kind of employment of persons, you know, where they are taken advantage of in very significant ways. Now, you as a parent company may want to adopt that philosophy, but the organizations that are your subsidiaries that are located in countries, and if we take Bangladesh as an example, where you have a lot of multinationals who would have set up operations in these organizations, but the local environment is one that does not have that particular legislation. Now, it puts you in a uniquely precarious position, because as a parent company, you want to ensure that you are abiding with these evolving practices of ensuring that certain things does not happen that is aligned in any way with your brand. But at the same time, we are seeing where the governance is telling you that there is a clear separation between what the parent board is responsible for and what directives they can give to the subsidiary companies. So
yeah. It's difficult because, and I mean, Bob will know this as well, but some of these laws actually apply to the subsidiaries as well. So, you know, if you look at the UK Bribery Act, which came in around the same time, we had a situation in Uganda for I think it was Tullow Oil, where there was a court case on a totally separate issue about licensing that was actually going on in the UK that related to these two British companies, but the licenses were actually for oil in Uganda. And one of the senior executives of the other company, which I think was Heritage Oil, made a statement that they thought an executive from Tullow Oil had paid money to the president of Uganda to get something to do with a tax relief or something off this license. Now, you know, the president denied it. There was, you know, things that happened in Uganda where they basically accepted that there hadn't been bribes paid. But it was quite interesting because the British Serious Fraud Squad actually had to come and investigate whether or not this was true, because of the fact there were UK parent companies involved. And you know, and as a result of that, I think a lot of the processes, some of the processes at Tullow Oil, and also I think Tullow Oil scaled back some of its operations in Uganda, because they obviously didn't want to be caught out by these kind of things that were happening. So I think it's a balance that somehow needs to be achieved between the pressures that are on the parent companies, where the parent company board members could potentially be put in jail or fined for things that are happening in subsidiaries around the world, against allowing the subsidiaries to have the freedom that they need to do what they need to do to be successful and sustainable. I mean, Bob's nodding, he may have additional comments to make.
Well, no, and I'd like to get other members talking. The one thing I'll say is, if you go on air right now in the US, the ExxonMobil case is being fought out in the courts. And that is absolutely fascinating, because I'm not sure how it happened, but the ExxonMobil head lobbyist was recorded saying the most outrageous things about the way they at headquarters were handling many issues, including the deliberate obfuscation of their specific strategies, and particularly the development and effects of their specific products, and the negative effect many of those were having, including 2 very particular and nasty chemicals. And what he was saying, although I'm amazed that he was caught saying it, was, we deliberately make things really messy and difficult from headquarters, so that we try and focus a lot of attention, and by that means he means money, onto really pushing up the fight against global climate change, especially. But we like to keep it very general, so they can't actually get anywhere near our products. And similarly, we are very keen for the headquarters to fund a lot of academic research, again, as long as it goes off in directions that stay a long way away from us and our products. So, as I say, if you can go on air right now and actually look at the ExxonMobil court case going on. But sometimes you get headquarters which, rather than say we must obey the Human Slavery Act, say we will put a lot of resource into ensuring that people can't get very close to us. And that's one of the big issues of that type of corporate structure. Can we open it up a bit?
Yes, absolutely. We do have 2 hands up. We have Camille Facey, who has joined us from Jamaica. So we will ask her to make her contribution first, and then we have Faye, who also has her hand up. So we'll go to Faye afterwards. Okay, Camille, so we invite you.
Hi, good morning. Hi, thank you for that. Your presentation, as usual, Professor, was brilliant. I learned so much every time I listened to you. And in listening to some of what Alison was saying in terms of the rollout of laws in parent companies in their subsidiary jurisdictions, I think sometimes it's a matter of respect. The respect that that parent company has for the countries in which they're doing business. And I recall when the Bribery Act was being rolled out in the UK, that we in Jamaica, the laws and the necessary statements were sent out to us. And I think what works well is when there is a law or some change, where the lead corporate secretary or the head of legal calls together the departments, the various departments in the different countries, explains what it is, the new law is, and then thereafter allows that head of legal or corporate secretary to then take it to their board, so that the directors in the local jurisdictions can understand what is being asked of them and therefore have an opportunity for input. But of course, that only happens where you have regard to those local subsidiaries rather than thinking that you can just issue an edict and because of who I am and because I'm the parent, it is so. So I just wanted to know that.
That's good.
Okay, Faye?
Hi.
Yeah,
I just wanted to sort of reflect a little bit on some of what is being said in terms of I think we both tried to lower my hand at the same time. One of the things I think you encounter in this field of corporate governance is a lot of assumptions that people have. You get invited to sit on a board, you have assumptions about what's expected of you, of what you can expect from the company. You know, even though there is all this governance thought and training around, you still have a lot of those assumptions. So you still have people who go on to subsidiary company boards on the understanding that they're there to take instructions from the parent. You have the issues of executives from the parent sitting as directors on those boards, believing their role to be to carry out the instructions of their parents as an executive of that company, and not recognizing their role as a director with responsibilities to that company itself. So you have all these assumptions, and so how do you address those assumptions? And you address them through things like training, induction programs, and boards actually self-reflecting as to what is their role and purpose and whether they are achieving that role and purpose. When we call it I think I agree with Bob, when you call it an evaluation, it just has a whole different sense to it. People perhaps sometimes are not open and sharing because, you know, evaluation has that very negative feel to it. But that boards really need to reflect on their role and their purpose. And I think we also, these new things that we are seeing in the governance of companies demonstrate some weaknesses in the corporate law that has pretty much remained the same way for hundreds of years. Things like the roles of the executive director. How is that? Yes, we say at law that person is a director with responsibilities to the company, but that person also has an employment contract and responsibilities there. And how do you protect that person? How do you protect the company and ensure that the board could do its job? So I think that it starts with a board self-reflecting, and in the case of a group, recognizing that you need a corporate governance structure for the group, that you can't just rely on assumptions. You have to make deliberate choices and understand how your group is structured, and therefore what kind of governance can be rolled out across this group, and what processes and policies need to be put in place to support those. So it would be interesting to see how it evolves, because I see a lot of activity in this area.
I see Dr. Garratt has his hand up. Yeah, Alison, let's ask Dr. Garratt to also contribute, and then you can respond to the concerns that Faye has raised. Yes, Dr. Farron?
No, yes, I just wanted to make a couple of points, both I guess from practical experience of having served with Faye actually on a parent board and being an executive director, and then currently as a director of RFHL, where we are in fact right at this point in time grappling with precisely these issues. But I want to just draw the meeting's attention to two very recent UK Supreme Court judgments. One is a case called Vedanta, and the other one is a case called Okabi. So these are UK parent companies with subsidiaries outside of the UK. And related issues, but basically the cases concern questions about pollution. So not similar to the questions that have been raised about supply chain and modern slavery and so on. That the subsidiaries had engaged in pollution activities, and they were being sued, but they also sued the parent company in the UK. And the UK Supreme Court indicated that yes, the parent company could be liable right? And so this case was not decided on the question of merit. The case being decided on the question of whether or not the cases could be brought in the United Kingdom in the first place. What is the appropriate forum or the appropriate jurisdiction? And secondly, what is the basis for the case? And the UK Supreme Court very interestingly said that it has nothing to do with company law, corporate law. This actually falls within tort law. And so therefore they say there's no new head of liability that we are creating here. This is tort law. This falls under the tort of negligence, and that applies, and that the parent has a duty of care. So if you can establish that the parent has a duty of care, and they pointed out that for the claimants to establish that the parent had a duty of care, you needed to look at things like, has the parent instituted a certain set of policies at the subsidiary and enforced those policies? That there was no presumption, they pointed out, against the fact that the parent company had no liability. So I thought there are two very interesting cases that I think indicate to parent company boards that once you have put a certain set of policies in place in your subsidiary company, and I would imagine to Faye's point about having executive directors being under subsidiaries and so on, might be taken to be an instance where you are in fact enforcing parent company policy and the subsidiary, you might end up being liable. And if that is the case, then a number of things then begin to flow from that. So I just want to make those points. Two very interesting cases, Vedanta and Okpabi.
So glad you raised those, yes, because it really demonstrates the more control that the parent company has, the more likely that duty of care exists. So the more devolved the subsidiary is, the less, the more you can separate out that company and negate that duty of care.
Yeah, it's really helpful.
Yes, Alison.
So Camilla, in response to some of the things that Faye was saying, I have come across some groups which are now appointing independent chairs or local chairmen to try and counter the kind of executives that are on the board that have come from within the group. And those chairmen are kind of within their regions getting together on a kind of chairman's group that will get together and talk about issues and challenges that they're having within the company. I mean, one of the biggest things when I've been doing board reviews within subsidiaries is this issue of the strategy being given by the parent to the particular subsidiary. So for instance, if it's a bank, that bank locally may be wanting to open branches in different places, or ATM machines in different places. And yet they're not allowed to do it because the parent has said, our policy is you have to have X number of people within that area before you can have an ATM, or that X number of people before you can have a branch. So they're restricted in how they can compete with local banks, which obviously has an impact on their own performance and sustainability. And so by grouping together, they've been able to then go back to the parent and try and explain within their region, whether it's East Africa or another part of the world, to the parent to say, these are the challenges and problems that we are having locally with your strategy, and are there ways that we can work with you so that we can amend the strategy in a way that works for us here, but still meet the kind of overriding goals that the organization as a whole is meeting. But I think, having governance that allows these independent people to be there on the board as well, I think is quite important at the subsidiary level.
Yes, so, you know, it really underscores, Alison, what is described today in the world of strategy, in particular of this VUCA environment that we currently inhabit, you know, where there's such volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, you know, in which organizations need to function today, and being able to really steer their organization in such a way that you are able to really get the best performance that's possible. But I see our chairman has his video on, so that is also going to suggest that he's ready to share a comment on this topic that we are discussing. Nigel?
Hi, how are you? Good conversation. I want to ask, well, Dr. Farrell and Professor Garratt and all of you. So Faye said that the distance or the level of autonomy may absolve the parents from liability. Is for me that Professor King said on Sunday that every board agenda should include considerations of the relationship between input, output, impact, outcome. And therefore, if I am the parent and I have a wholly owned subsidiary in a country, if I don't put the governance in place to ensure that the output, impact, and outcome of the subsidiary's policies on something like pollution, can I hide behind the fact that, well, it's run independently? I would be interested in hearing the response.
What do you think, Professor Garratt?
Well, I was going to refer it to Dr. Farrell immediately, because the two cases you mentioned are so important that I think he might elaborate on those a little bit, please.
Yes, Dr. Farrell, we are inviting you to come back into the conversation here.
I think while he's coming back, because there's the other one of Shell as well that was referred to. So I think I think it depends which country the parent comes from. But I think certainly, Bob, as you were saying, from the US and I think from the UK, I think you wouldn't be able to say, well, you know, that's a subsidiary out there and we don't really pay attention to it. I don't think that will get you very far in the court of law in the UK.
Not nowadays. It might have done, but not now.
Yeah.
I see Terry hasn't come back on as yet, but I would venture to say that this is really groundbreaking new stuff. This is not settled law, and there's going to be differences around, and so it really depends always, as in most case law, it would depend on the circumstances of the case. But clearly, if you as a parent company board are giving very specific directions, a specific strategy, specific directions that are going to be rolled out by your subsidiary, you have connected yourself very closely to the outcomes that happen out there. Whereas if you have a more of an umbrella sort of governance strategy or governance processes that you have rolled out, and there's a certain amount of freedom within those processes, there may be opportunity there for the parent company to divorce itself from the decision of the subsidiary. But having said that, some of the claims that are coming through are overriding principle kind of claims. They relate to slavery, they relate to destruction of the environment and so on. So it's kind of hard for a parent company to separate itself from that duty of care with respect to things like that.
That is what was going through my mind just now too.
So as you said that, when Dr. Farrell spoke about state-owned enterprises, he very clearly said that a director cannot hide behind the fact that the minister told him to do it.
Absolutely.
So how can a director hide behind the fact that my parent company board told me to do it?
Well,
if as a result of following that directive, there is pollution.
the director, don't think that the director cannot be sued. The director can be sued, but people who are making claims are going after those who can meet the claims. So it's very unlikely that that director can pay for the environmental damage that has happened over years by the mining in your particular country. So they almost jump over those directors as being irrelevant. So you're very lucky. But if your checkbook could manage it, you would be sure to be sued, because yes, you can't hide behind instructions. And unfortunately, many persons sitting on boards, particularly I think executive directors, don't get that and believe that they can do it. They should be doing as they're told.
And that's where we have to educate them that they need to be clear that their responsibility is in this case to the subsidiary and the continuance of the subsidiary. And there will always be that tension between the business and the function, between the sub and the parent. And there has to be dialogue. But
I think that's what you're striving for. You're striving for a healthy tension. And I mean, that is what business is all about. There's always this tension between the risk and the reward and all these different things. And what you are striving for is a healthy tension where, because it's good for the parent company to get this feedback from the subsidiary board, as Alison pointed out, where a strategy just isn't workable in this particular jurisdiction. And maybe it is the parent has to exit that jurisdiction or rethink their strategy. So what you're looking for is not a one-way channel of instruction, but a channel of communication.
No,
I think the point I was going to make was the other point that Terry made, which was that they were looking at this from a perspective of tort, not company law. Because I think one of the things many directors think is, oh, well, I'm protected because if I put some kind of dissenting view into the minutes or make it clear that I'm not happy with this, but I'm doing it because of X, Y, Z, that somehow they're protected. And I think, Faye, as company secretaries, I mean, we often have to advise directors that, yes, under company law, that might protect you, but there are now this whole raft of other laws. And it was interesting to hear even tort coming into the conversation that you do become, or you might become liable under. And so you can't just say now, well, because I've dissented, I'm safe. It doesn't work that way anymore.
I'm not entirely sure, because those cases were cases that were holding the parent company responsible. They weren't actually cases looking at the role of the director. So you could theoretically probably still escape responsibility by dissenting. But also if directors are dissenting from every decision, they really need to get off that board, because either they're in the wrong place. Or
if you're owing your duty to the company or to a shareholder, and the company gets sued, then they might be able to come at you and say, well, you dissented, maybe you should have done more.
Well, that is a whole new area of corporate law, I think, that would be evolving there. But interestingly, these were cases that are trying to get around the corporate veil concept and You also see some evolution of this in the corporate tax. So the whole question of developing structures for tax shelters and things like that are also receiving some interesting attention.
So I too was initially under that full notion that so long as you dissented as a director, well, then that means you can prove the fact that you ought not to fall under that whole collective responsibility and be liable. But I'm also agreeing with Faye in that you can't simply dissent, because your duty of care requires that you now also bring reason for why and try to persuade that board as to what may be alternative options that need to be considered to ensure whatever adverse impact that you are thinking is likely to happen, is dealt with.
That's actually quite an interesting point you raised there, because I also do a session with Corporate Governance Institute on writing minutes, and in the process of developing that, I did some research into this whole question of writing minutes. And one of the interesting things that came out through some of the commissions of inquiry that went on in the last few years on certain financial debacles is that if you have a very serious decision, of course, not something too minor, where you have a director who dissents and the board nevertheless goes ahead, you want to record in those minutes that the board understood the reason for the consent and they made a deliberate decision on why, to demonstrate that the board is actually taking into account everything that's relevant to this decision in coming to their decision. So if a director dissents and the rest of the board just goes ahead without actually recording the fact as to why they're taking this particular route, then they could find themselves responsible for breach of duty. It's a rich field of learning, evolving.
Yes. And I find absolutely fascinating, and I'm so happy that there are so many people who equally find it fascinating, and so will engage with us in understanding more as we unravel these issues to help improve our governance practices. So I just wanted to read the comment from Camille in the chat too, where she indicated we also need to educate our ministers and parent companies about these new expectations and evolving thought. So we are at 12:25. It has been an absolutely amazing morning for me. I found that these rich discussions lends clarity, in so many ways, but also brings additional questions. Because as we close, and I'm going to ask Professor Garratt, to share his final thoughts just for us to close this session. But I want to still recollect and add that point that Faye made as she started her contribution, which is that oftentimes directors make assumptions about what really is their role and function and to whom they owe their duty, and that then influences the way they make decisions moving forward. And those assumptions are some of the things that we are challenging fundamentally. So, Professor Garratt, may I just ask you to share some closing thoughts for us before we bring this morning's session to a close?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted with the quality of the debate. Thank you very much, everybody. And I'm intrigued. I must look further into these two recent UK Supreme Court tort decisions, just to check them out, because they sound very important to me, at least. But I sadly now will be dropping out of the conference. As I say, I have to deliver a book by Sunday evening, or at least the main draft of the book by Sunday evening. So I'm on my knees at the moment, trying to get all that together. But it's been really, really helpful. In fact, the whole conference has been really helpful, just to test out my final thoughts as I went through the week. So thank you particularly to Kamla and the board for putting it on. I think you've done another blinder. So enjoy the rest of it, and I think in one of the things that's coming through, back to values, back to mindset change, back to conscience and such a thing. If I put my small South African hat on, in Zulu, there is a word which Nelson Mandela used an awful lot called Ubuntu. And the simplest translation of Ubuntu is I am because we are. And I think one of the conscience parts of the boards at the moment is around people beginning to realize that boards are not free floating entities in a world, but are actually very much part of the social, environmental framework. And so that notion of I am because we are is very important indeed. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Garratt, and we truly appreciate your input in this Governance Week as well. And we totally understand that you have your deadlines as well. We will miss you for today, because today, of course, is one of those days where expertise is not as available because we don't have as many groups and conglomerates in the region, but it is necessary because they have such fundamental impacts on our environment. But we do understand, and we will certainly keep in touch with you as we move forward. Oh, and just before Professor Garratt goes, I had mentioned the International Learning Network earlier today, and I want to share that our next meeting is on August 4th, and we would have Professor Frank Kuneman from Curacao, who is actually in the Netherlands at the moment, who will be doing the key presentation, and he'd be looking at board culture. So thanks to Professor Garratt for really initiating that whole exercise with us. So it gives us that vehicle for continuing the conversation, even outside of these sessions. So as we say goodbye to you, Professor Garratt, we say thanks as well. Okay, so
thank you. Bye.
By the rest of persons in the room, I just want to acknowledge the impact the current hurricane is having on our session. We have panelists who had been scheduled to be part of today's session, initially, especially out of Barbados. They're being adversely impacted, and therefore we have two of them who will not be able to join us today, as Professor Garratt had shared earlier. That is Ronaele Daythorne Bayrd from Barbados. And I was so looking forward to hearing Mr. Anthony Ali, who is the Managing Director of Garratt Enterprises. But unfortunately, you know, we will have to connect with him some other time. However, we do have still some brilliant minds who will continue today's sessions. Those include Alison, who just joined the conversation with us with Professor Garratt. So that's Alison Dillon Chibilige. We have Mrs. Gail Moss Solomon, the Honorable Douglas O'Rain, as well as Wendy Kerry, Jacqueline Quamana, and Sandy Glasgow. These are representatives not only from Trinidad and Tobago, but Jamaica as well. So we continue to have a regional discussion. So thank you all very much. A reminder to those of you who have been with us, and to let those of you who are new for today, the first day, each session is in a different virtual room. So as we close today, you now need to click on the next link on your agenda, which takes us into the first panel discussion for today. We take a short break of a half hour before we begin that session. However, we do open the room immediately as we close this one. So you can connect using your link, settle in, and then take your short break before we begin the next panel, which will be moderated by Dr. Ron Supram and will include Alison and Mrs. Gail Moss Solomon. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you in a few minutes in the other room.